He had spent his whole life cursing the Apache name, swearing he'd never show them mercy. But that night, under the mesquite, his horse balked, because there in the dust lay a girl, bleeding, barely breathing. Why didn't he ride on? Why did a man who lived by hate feel his hands tremble as he reached for her? The desert air bit sharp, cold enough to split skin. The cowboy's horse snorted, ears pinned, refusing to move. He cursed, tugged the reins, then saw what had stopped it. A shape half hidden in the arroyo, tangled in brush. Small, broken. When he dismounted and stepped closer, the moon showed him the truth. A young Apache girl, her dress torn, blood dark across her side, his jaw locked. His whole life he'd spat on their kind. They'd taken cattle, burned wagons, left graves in his family's wake. He'd sworn never to lift a hand for them except in anger. Yet here she was, eyes fluttering open, fixing on him with the dull shine of someone halfway to death. No words, only the faintest breath, a plea too weak to shape. He stood frozen, fists clenched. He could walk away, tell himself it wasn't his fight. He almost did. His boots even turned back toward the horse. Then he heard it, the smallest sound, not a word, not even a cry. Just the way her hand twitched in the dirt, reaching toward him before falling limp again. His breath came ragged. He swore under it, spat into the dust and dropped to his knees beside her. "Damn you," he muttered, though his hands were already tearing his water skin open, pressing cloth to her wound. "Damn you for making me do this." The girl's lips parted. No thanks, no fear, just the faintest whisper of air that almost sounded like please. The cowboy shut his eyes tight, cursing the weight on his chest. For the first time in years, hate wasn't enough. And when dawn touched the ridge, he was still there, keeping pressure on her wound, his horse tied close, because something in him had shifted, and he knew, whatever happened next, he would never see her people the same again. The sun rose with great force and speed, transformed the desert into a golden hue. When the cowboy finally managed to get the girl aboard his horse, the shirt he was wearing was already swollen with the girl's blood. She leaned against the saddle horn, her head lolling and her breaths taken in weak breaths. When he climbed behind her, he put one arm on her to keep her steady, while the other gripped the reins tightly. With every hoofbeat, her wound was jarred. His jaw became more clenched with each one of them. He said, "Don't you die on me," even though he was still unsure of the reason he was concerned about me. The sweat had already begun to run down his cheeks by the time the ranch house came into view. It was the hands in the front that picked him up first. A lanky cowpoke by the name of Brent squinted a little bit. "Boss, what exactly are you carrying this time?" With his boots making a thud, he slipped from the saddle. It appeared as though the girl was already slipping away, as her weight seemed to be lighter than it should have been. "Get me some water," he yelled out. Nothing happened to Brent. The pupils in his eyes contracted. "Her name is Apache." The cowboy's look had the potential to sever stone. "Yes, I did say water." After swallowing, Brent ran away. There was a strong aroma of coffee and dust inside the house. He then proceeded to pull strips from a sheet with rough hands while he lay the girl down on his bed. While her lips broke, her eyes fluttered. Words that he had never bothered to learn were spoken by her whispering something in her tongue. The feeling of guilt pierced him for a brief while. "Regardless," he whispered her, "do not waste your strength." As soon as Brent entered the room with a bucket, 3 other hands followed closely behind him, whispering sharply. A more senior individual spit on the floorboards. "Throughout your whole life, you have had a deep-seated hatred for them. To what does this refer? You're softening up, no?" As he applied pressure to the wound with the handkerchief, the cowboy felt the blood flowing hot on his fingers. "This indicates that she was dying in the dirt, and I wasn't going to allow coyotes to finish what men had put in motion." A frown appeared on the face of the veteran. "Her kindness brought a large number of coyotes to us." The cowboy yelled out, "Get out of here!" After a moment of hesitation, the man walked away while grumbling. Brent lingered, his face pallid. "Boss, the neighbors will come if they hear about this," the boss said. "First, they won't bother to ask any questions." Through clenched teeth, the cowboy extracted blood from the fabric. "Allow them to come." The young lady groaned and rubbed her eyes. She had a surprising amount of strength as she caught his sleeve. The movement of her lips formed a single English word that was harsh but unequivocal. Stay. The man's chest tightened. In order to protect her delicate fingers, he placed his rough palm over her hand. I am present. Brent was trembling behind him as he breathed. You have a deep-seated hatred for Apaches, boss, as has always stated. What has transformed? The cowboy did not dare to turn around. The tone of his voice was murky and risky. That could be everything's. Neighbors were already riding in, and they could be heard coming from the porch. Trails of dust cut across the horizon. Brent's expression darkened in alarm. They have witnessed her. The cowboy stood up, his hand falling to the handgun that was resting on his hip. It is then that they will also hear me. In spite of the fact that blood was still fresh on his palms, he pulled the door open and stepped into the spotlight. Rifles were slung across the saddles of the quickly approaching men. For the first time in years, he was aware that the battle that lay ahead was not going to be against Apaches. His own race was being attacked by it. Dust began to boil as 3 horsemen slammed into the porch with a great deal of force. While their horses snorted and pawed their hooves, their muzzles were flecked with foam. Their faces were leathered by the sun and their grudges, and they were armed with weapons that were already hanging loosely in their hands. Caleb Rusk, who was in control of the situation, spat into the ground. Heard a story that was coming in. You are correct, Mason. You have an Apache living in your home, right? On the porch, the cowboy, whose name was Mason, stood erect with his gun at his hip and his clothing still smeared with blood. His body did not flinch. I have a female who is only half dead living under my home. Actually, it is the case. Caleb's lip tightened up. Her native blood is Apache, regardless of how young they are. At the end of the day, they all turn out to be murderers. Hale, another cyclist, smirked in a belligerent manner behind him. Yui, on the other hand, detested their sort more than any of us. In the past, you would boast about the graves you dug following raids. Are you now acting as a nurse? The third individual leaned on the horn of his saddle. Mason, people are talking about you. As soon as you begin to eat bread with them, you will bring war upon each and every one of us. Mason's jaw was in motion. He did not tighten his grip on his hands, but his voice was as resolute as iron. She was abandoned to meet her end in the mud. There is no way I'm going to give her over to buzzards or coyotes. A smirk from Caleb. There is no mercy in that. What a betrayal that is. The girl, who was attempting to breathe, could be heard within coughing weakly. Only once did Mason's eyes flick back to the front. That minuscule sound caused a twisting sensation in his stomach. He stepped off the porch, his boots settling into the dust before him. You look me in the eyes and then proceed to shoot a youngster who has been injured. You came here to do it. You'll have to go through me first, though. Hale let out a chuckle, but it was not delivered with a steady tone. Pay attention to self-talk. You are defending her as if she were a member of your own family. Mason's voice became resonant. At this point, she is mine. I discovered her. I cling to her. The words hung like a needle. Even though he was standing at the doorway, Brent, who was pale, blinked as if he had never heard Mason talk in such a manner before. As Caleb worked on his reins, his knuckles became white. You are going to cause problems for each and every ranch in this valley. It will be the soldiers. There will be tribes. If there is any blood that does spill, it will be on your head. It's possible, Mason remarked, that it will... He narrowed his eyes, his gaze as steady as his draw. But not at this time. It is secure for her today. Only the sound of horses breathing could be heard on the street. In addition to spitting, Hale snarled, "How you'll regret it," and then grabbed his reins. The other two whirled around with him, their expressions tense and angry. They rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust that resembled smoke coming from a fuse. The breath that Brent exhaled was ragged. It's okay, boss, they'll come back. In the future, not just 3 times. The eyes of Mason remained fixed on the ridge as he holstered his handgun. Let them go. I will not give in. Inside, the young lady spoke once more in a hushed voice, her English rudimentary but unmistakably clear. Why, help me. While he was crouching at her side, Mason re-entered the room. The sound of his voice was more harsh than he had intended, due to the fact that no one has ever done the same for me. Once more, her hand grabbed for his sleeve, and it was shaking with fear. He allowed it to happen. From the outside, the wind carried the sound of hooves that were retreating. It was not a retreat, however. It was a strong warning. All of a sudden, the valley had been divided in half. By the time night fell, the entire valley was aware. Mason invited an Apache girl into his home, and the news traveled as quickly as fire across parched grass. At the saloon, the glasses crashed more forcefully, and the voices intensified. One man snarled, "He's completely lost his mind." Another individual moved close to the bar and whispered in a loud enough voice for half of the room to hear. "He's dragging trouble onto all of us," they said. "What if she is only a bait? If the others of her type were to come sniffing about, what would happen?" Mason has not yet been confronted with the truth. However, every single boot that went by his ranch the following day paused for an excessively long time. Each window shutter had a breach that was just large enough to admit a spy. The girl was found lying on the bed inside the ranch home, looking pale. Her temperature was heating up, and her lips were cracking. The hard hands that Mason used to dab water across her mouth were more gentle than he remembered they might be from the past. With a mumble, he said, "You need to drink." A feeble swallow came out of her mouth, and her eyes opened just enough to meet his. It was the first time that he saw something that was not only broken, but also watching him, as if she was trying to figure out why he was still there. While he was standing in the doorway, Brent was twirling his hat in his hands. "You are not allowed to keep her here, boss. They will mount their horses, armed with pitchforks and weapons, and accuse you of betraying the valley." Mason spoke in a hushed voice as he wrung the towel out. "Let them choose what they want to say." Brent maintained his position that you can't fight a whole town. It is imperative that you conceal her, even if you do not give her up. It could be somewhere in the canyon, a location where they are unable to view her face. Mason slowed down, his eyes the color of iron. "This is not a secret at all. She is not a source of shame." However, Brent's dread did not go away even if he was silent. In the afternoon of that day, Mason harnessed his horse. In spite of Brent's objections, he proceeded to wrap the girl in a blanket and then carefully lifted her into his arms. However, her breath shook against his chest, despite the fact that she was as light as a bag of feathers. "With whom are you going to take her?" Brent hissed angrily. "According to Mason, or into town. The town will see you and hang you." Mason responded, "Then let them give it a shot." The atmosphere in the saloon became icy as soon as he pushed through the doors, dice in the air, glasses halfway to the lips, and laughter that is completely clean. The bundle that he was holding captured everyone's attention. When Mason had finished putting her down gently on a bench, he straightened his shoulders and squatted down. "Oh, do you have any inquiries?" His voice reverberated through the room like a shot from a gun. "You should ask them to me, not to a youngster who is dying." There were murmurings. With his face flushed, Caleb Rusk stood up from his table. "We do not require any inquiries. We have already witnessed the reality. You take their side, and you are no longer considered to be one of us." Mason's jaw curved forward. "Due to the fact that she is a child, I am on her side, because I was able to locate her, and I will witness her in person." It was a drunken snort. "Are you alive? This is where she will bring her people. Do you intend to throw open your doors and let them to cut our throats?" The hand of Mason was calmly resting on his gun, and it was not drawn. "Any Apache who comes to this village with the intention of fighting will not discover me to be a weakling. However, she is not a war. She is merely in pain." There was a pause in the saloon's breathing. First, the young lady made a feeble coughing sound, and then she murmured something in her tongue. Despite the fact that no one understood the words, the manner in which her palm gripped Mason's sleeve spoke more than words could ever convey. Before turning his gaze back to the room, Mason peered down at her. Although his voice was low, it was audible in every nook and cranny. "I have a deep-seated hatred for Apaches. I believed that loathing made me more powerful. The night before, however, I was kneeling in the mud next to a child who was dying, and I realized that hatred does not prevent blood from spilling. There is no way to stop coyotes from tearing apart a body. Doesn't make a man worth a damn," the man said. A smirk from Caleb. To put it another way, you would toss away years of fighting and burying relatives with your own hands simply for her. No one was able to break Mason's stare. I'd be in a worse situation. I would tell you right now that she is mine if I were standing here. In order to acquire her, you will have to take my life. The saloon exploded in a shouting, cursing, and stomping of boots. Others remained sitting, feeling apprehensive, while others slammed their glasses down and stood up. The distinction between them was unmistakable. The sheriff pushed his way in the door, his badge catching the light from the lantern. "Enough is enough," he yelled out. His gaze traveled over the room before settling on Mason. "Mason, you want her to be secure, right? That is, you continue to house her in your home. However, you draw her out in such a manner that you are dragging fire into dry grass here." There was no roundness about Mason's shoulders. "No, she is not of fire. She is made of earth and blood." The sheriff's jaw narrowed in response. In addition, if people are sufficiently terrified, flesh and blood can set an entire town ablaze. The girl coughed once again, her head resting against Mason's arm as she did so. Sharper than steel, the sound pierced through the atmosphere of cacophony. There was a brief pause in which the room remained silent. Mason pulled her carefully, allowing the blanket to fall back to expose the cutting edge of her wound. His eyes were fixed on the crowd. "Take a look at her. Now is the time to label her an enemy if you still intend to do so. It is spoken aloud, where she is able to hear it." Nobody made a sound. A heaving sigh came from the sheriff. "Mason, come and take her home, before anybody in this place becomes a moron." Mason took a step out into the darkness while holding the girl, who was shaking in his arms. When he turned around, the saloon buzzed like a swarm that was about to rupture. His internal conflict, which he had been harboring for many years, had finally been brought out into the open. Also, the town had not yet finished dealing with him. The ranch was eerily quiet when the next morning arrived. Nobody came by for a cup of coffee or to make a deal, and there were no carts that squeaked along the lane. Despite the uncomfortable atmosphere, even the ranch hands kept their heads down and worked in silence. The horizon was being observed by Mason as he stood on the porch with his arms folded. His hat was in his hands as he slowly approached. He went on to say, "Boss, no one is going to sell us feed today." The door was slammed shut in my face by the storekeeper. "As you stated, you picked your side." Mason's jaw was clenched tightly. "After that, we cultivate our own." Brent made a change. "That is not the limit." A couple of the young men packed their belongings. The individual stated that they do not work for a man who protects what has been hunting us for years. There was no flinch on Mason's part, but the words struck him hard. Allow them to depart. A fever was still present, and the girl stirred within the house. The sound of her cough shook the walls. While he was bringing her water, Mason lifted her head so that she could take a sip. She looked at his face with eyes that were black and keen, despite the fact that she was feeble. "Why is that?" Her English was slurred but clear enough to be understood. She mumbled. "What is the reason?" So he inquired. "Why do you continue? Do you despise us?" To a greater extent than any bullet, the words penetrated. The material dripped onto the blanket as he froze instantly. He had repeated it so frequently that the desert itself could hear it, and she was correct in her assessment. Abhorred her own people. He detested the recollection of what he had shed. Because of his hands, she was clinging to life despite the fact that she was as frail as glass. Although his voice was scratchy, he said, "I did hate. It is still possible. Not you, however." Her brow set in a frown. "Not the same." The man gave a head shake. "Not the same?" She gave him a long look before giving him a single nod, as if she could live with that answer, at least for the time being. More indications appeared by the afternoon. The posts of the fence were moved. Near the creek there was a dead calf that had a bullet in its skull, a communication that is devoid of words. Brent entered the barn with a vengeance. Caleb and his sons are the ones responsible. We are receiving warnings from them. While maintaining his composure, Mason checked his gun. Warnings consist of squandered breath. If they are interested in coming, they will come. But the girl, Brent began his statement. "She won't leave," Mason interrupted him. "She is not going to leave." At that very moment, Mason was sitting at the table, gazing intently at a lantern flame while the girl was sleeping in his bed. The place had a scent that was a combination of sickness and smoke. Every sound that came from the outside, whether it was an owl, the wind, or a limb breaking, sounded like folks congregating. In the opposite direction, Brent slouched. "I'm sorry, boss, but I just don't get it. You made a name for yourself by detesting them. Now you are going to destroy everything for a girl that you have no idea who she is." Mason did not raise his gaze from the flame. "Maybe I'm not familiar with her. However, I am aware of what it is like to be abandoned in the mud. By oneself. No one to pick you up," he said with a low voice as he leaned back. "I made a solemn vow that I would never be that man. Not once again." The face was rubbed by Brent. "They are going to put it to the test, so we had well be prepared. On each and every day." A faint sound emanated from the bedroom, and it was her voice uttering his name in a whisper for the very first time. "Mason" is the only word that should be used, not cowboy, white man, or enemy. His chest became more constricted. He got to his feet, made his way to the entrance, and rested against the doorframe. Her eyes were hazy, and she appeared to be half sleeping, but the word had been genuine. Mason came to the realization that hatred was not the most burdensome thing a man could carry for the very first time in his life. In addition, when the wind picked up outside, causing the shutters to shake, he was aware that the valley would drive him to demonstrate it before he was ready to do so. A dog's bark started the night, and then there was complete silence that was so abrupt that it made Mason's skin crawl. Even before the flame of the lantern became stable, he was already standing. As he emerged from the barn, Brent's face was quite pale. The riders, not just 3, but even more, coming on strong. Instantaneously, Mason grabbed his weapon and loaded it. How many are there? At least half a dozen to be exact. On the bed, the young lady shook weakly, her eyes only partially open. The only word that she uttered was, "Stay." A hand was placed on her shoulder by him. "There's no way I'm going anywhere." Next, he pushed Brent in the direction of the window. "Keep the shutters closed. Put an end to the lamp." The sound of hooves raged outside. The ranch house shook when men dismounted, their boots crushing gravel against the ground. Voices whispered, and Caleb's drawl could be heard from the cracks in the walls. "We are going to complete this tonight. Take her out of the way and we'll set the others ablaze." Mason braced himself at the entrance, maintaining a steady rifle grip. He whispered, "Brent, there will be no shots fired unless I fire first. Give them the impression that we are more than 2. Trembling, the young lady struggled to pull herself up. The fight. With a strong and firm gaze, he turned his attention back to her. "Only if it is absolutely necessary. You maintain a modest profile." The door was hammered with a fist. "Mr. Mason, we will take her in pieces if you do not hand her over." The girl's raspy breathing was the only thing that broke the silence that stretched out, calm and as keen as steel. Mason's voice rang through. "Right now she is mine. It is through me that you will obtain her." A chuckle made outside. After that, the sound of torches being lit crept in. Then Brent snarled, "They're going to set the place on fire." In a hushed voice, Mason replied, "Not if we break 'em first." With his rifle pointed, he swung the door open wide. As the glare engulfed the first torchbearer, their eyes widened in shock. Mason fired a single shot. Sparks may be seen spraying the ground as the torches released from the man's grasp. The chaos broke out. Dispersion of boots, shouts, and curses, etc. Caleb yelled out in a resounding voice, "Kill him!" The sound of gunfire shook the night as rounds tore into the beams of the porch walls. A second torch was dropped by Mason after he ducked and fired back. One of the riders was thrown from his horse as a result of the shotgun that Brent had broken out of the window. After dragging the blanket with her, the young lady climbed out of bed and crawled away. She made it to the ground just in time to see the glass smashed above her. She leaned herself against the wall and uttered the words, "Stay, stay," as if she were praying. After reloading, Mason took a deep breath. He was able to make out Caleb's silhouette in the darkness, with his gun elevated and aimed directly at the window where Brent was crouching. Mason simply did not think. He discharged the gun. Caleb was sent to one knee as the bullet grazed his scalp, causing his hat to fly into the air. All of the others failed. Some of them ran amok. Someone shouted, "He's crazy! It's going to be our end." After stepping out onto the porch, Mason's eyes were burning and smoke was curling up from his barrel. "Why do you want her? Take her with you, please." There was no movement at all. Despite being injured, Caleb's soldiers retreated and muttered amongst themselves. A person let go of his firearm. Another came to the fore. Caleb stumbled to his feet, blood trickling over his hair. As he pointed, his anger caused him to shake. "Mason, this is not yet finished. You have made your resolution. The following time, we will bring the entire valley." After that, he swung himself into the saddle and kicked fiercely. The remaining individuals followed, their hooves hammering away and their torches tumbling in the dust. Once more the night remained silent. Lead had left scars on the wood of the porch posts, and smoke was drifting from them. Brent leaned against the wall, which caused his breath to shake. We were able to get them to stop. However, they will return, and this time they will be more powerful. Mason brought his weapon down while heaving his chest. "Let them go." He felt a little hand tugging on his coat from behind him. With the blanket dragging behind her, the child had crawled to the porch. Her eyes were watery but unbreakable despite the moisture. "You stayed," she murmured to herself. He got down on his knees and cupped her shoulder. "I knew I would," she said. The curvature of her lips was subtle but genuine. She uttered his name precisely and without any tremors for the very first time, the word Mason. It was a forceful swallow. After hearing that sound, every wound caused by hatred began to fracture somewhat more deeply. A second time, the valley would appear, this time accompanied by fire, law, and numbers. Mason realized that he was no longer simply battling for her as he scooped her into his arms and brought her back inside the house. The man he had never allowed himself to become was the one he was fighting for. Following the attack, the community had the sensation of being a powder keg that was waiting for a spark to ignite it. The girl was wrapped in a blanket and placed over Mason's saddle as he made his leisurely approach. With his teeth clenched and his shotgun strapped over his back, Brent followed closely behind. As they walked by, the doors to the saloon swung open. A stream of men emerged, their voices as keen as knives. A few of them spit in the dust, while others watched with their arms folded like vultures. When Sheriff Dugan emerged off the boardwalk, his badge was lackluster and his face was etched with concern. And he yelled out, "Mason, there are more hornets that you are stirring than you are able to swat." Mason held his ground, his jaw clenched. "I was visited by hornets the night before. It was a lot of swatting." With his head bandaged and a look of wrath in his eyes, Caleb made his way through the mob. "A surplus. You opened fire on your neighbors. You chose her out of all of us." The young lady was tenderly placed on her feet by Mason when he dismounted his horse. Her legs were shaking, but she remained stable as she grabbed to his coat. He made the decision. "I did not allow a group of cowards to take the life of a child." The crowd let forth a growl. A few individuals murmured the word traitor, while others gave a little nod, recalling instances in which Mason had fought raiders, lost cattle, and buried relatives. Caleb pointed his finger in the direction of the female. "She is not a part of this place. The Apache is her. You are aware of what her companions did." The girl retreated to Mason's side and hid her face. The tight grip of his hand was placed on her shoulder. "Choice what she did was instead of bleeding on your floor, she bled on mine. That is the only thing." The sheriff put his hands up in the air. "That's enough. This town makes decisions as a unified unit, not as a mob. You want him to be guilty, so we do it in the open, where it is seen to everyone and not in the shadows." Before midday, the entire valley had gathered together. The horses were roped tightly, and dust was churning under their boots. Eyes were riveted on Mason and the girl who was standing next to him as a group of men and women stood in a tight circle. Words of scripture were attempted by the preacher, but they were drowned out by jeers. Caleb yelled over them in discord, "Because he is guarding an adversary. Every child in this town is now in jeopardy as a result of his. All of you witnessed the fire and the gunfire, not even close to the beginning." It came as a surprise to Brent when he took the initiative. and you've seen him engage in combat as well. While the rest of you hid, you witnessed him driving them away, you said. A rumble could be heard. Mason maintained his silence while his eyes scanned the gathering in anticipation. The young lady pulled on his coat. A hushed voice spoke. "Let me." He lowered himself and looked directly into her eyes. "Are you sure?" Small yet furious, she gave a slight nod. "It is true." He then took a step back. When she walked forward on her own, the blanket sliding off her shoulders and the scars on her arms shining brightly, the circle let out a gasp. Her tone was weak and affected, but it was unmistakable. "My name is not a curse. I did not set fire to any barns. Cattle were not killed by me. I was abandoned in the mud." As she pointed at Mason, she said, "He found me." He did not leave. The throng fell silent. Her dark gaze traveled over the faces of those who had referred to her as something worthless. "I need nothing," she said. "A lack of food and a roof. Only one thing. Do not provoke him to hate once more. That is enough hatred for him." There is no sound. In the absence of sound, even Caleb's mouth functioned. After that, an elderly ranch wife with gray hair braided stated her mind from the audience. "There was a time when I buried a young boy. Nobody remained loyal to him. If Mason does indeed declare that he will remain for her, then perhaps he is more capable than we gave him credit for." The murmurs go on. Even though he spat in the dust, the man did not argue. Another person gave a shrug and murmured, "He's carried this valley on his back more than there have been times." As his voice broke, Caleb growled angrily, "You are going to be sorry. He will bring about war." He was cut off by Sheriff Dugan, who slammed his rifle into his palm just briefly. "That's enough. This town is sick and tired of seeing youngsters perish in the dust. They are kept by Mason. As of right moment, that is the law." Despite her exhaustion, the girl maintained a proud chin as she swayed. In order to prevent her from falling, Mason grabbed her and brought her back into his arms. Even though the mutterings were still heavy, the gathering began to disperse, but something had changed. It was stated by her. Also, they had paid attention. While Mason was carrying her toward his horse, Brent murmured, "You know this ain't the end." Mason was carrying her. The tone of Mason's voice was low and firm. "It is not. This is the beginning." And on the ridge, a cloud of dust erupted. It was not neighbors who were coming this time. Rather, it was more riders. Soldiers, armed with documents and orders that no group of citizens could possibly be able to conceal. Towards the end of the afternoon, the cloud of dust that was above the ridge evolved into a column. The sunlight that was captured on the brass buckles and bayonets. A wagon, the kind that was designed for prisoners rather than children, rolled behind them. As the citizens of the town made their way back into the square, murmurings began to reappear. A mumbled "Fort Larrabee" came from Brent. He had a pallid face as he spoke. "They sent an entire detail." Mason was holding the girl securely in his arms as he stood at the edge of the mob. She was still feeble, with her head resting against his chest, despite the fact that her temperature had subsided. As the soldiers brought themselves under control, their feet struck the ground in synchrony, each one as sharp as iron. At that moment, the officer who was leading them, a captain with a chiseled jaw and boots that had been polished, walked forward while holding a scroll. His voice yelled out, "Sheriff Dugan, we are here to take custody of one Apache miner, female, who was found in unauthorized possession," he said, as he cracked the paper open, the red seal flashing brightly. "This is by order of the territorial governor to take custody of—" It is expected that she would be transferred to Fort Care without delay. There was a ripple of gasps, the grin that Caleb had returned. "Mason, did you even hear that? Even the law acknowledges that she is not yours." Mason was able to keep his voice down while his jaw was working. "Don't let the law bleed. She did it. On my hands, on my floor," she said. The captain's eyes became more narrowed. "This is not the point at all. The fact that you are harboring her constitutes a violation. Give her over to me." Mason's coat was being held by the girl as she stirred. "It's not true," she hushed. A louder tone was used by the officer. "You do not have a choice for this, child." The sheriff, however, took everyone by surprise. He got in the way of Mason and the captain a little bit. Perhaps that is the case. All of us witnessed her standing this morning. It was she who spoke. Her request was for him, and it is something that carries weight in this town. Captain snorted with disdain. Don't put me to the test, Sheriff. I have 30 weapons in my rearview mirror. In response, Dugan retorted, and I already have 30 graves filled with this dirt. Because of the matter of paper, we have to bury one more child, and it won't be your guys who are left behind, it will be our very beings. The crowd began to move, with some individuals nodding and others shifting uncomfortably. Mason was finally successful in getting the girl to stand up. Despite her trembling, she remained standing. The tight grip of his hand remained on her shoulder. While maintaining eye contact with the captain, he stated, "If you want to take her, then you should write it plain. Take note of the fact that you took a youngster who had been looking for a father and ended up finding one." The cop became red-faced. Then he snapped his fingers and said, "Enough." Irons in their hands, 2 marshals walked forward from behind. The young lady's voice was trembling but still carried, "Stay." She rubbed herself against Mason's side and pressed forward. The soldiers exhibited a moment of hesitation. Although Mason's stance was firm, the handgun he was holding was already slack in his palm. He cautioned, "One step closer and you find out if I mean it. It's coming to you." Let out a gasp. Several rifles jerked. The triggers were being held by a dozen fingers. Sensing the edge, the captain paused in his tracks. If there was even one incorrect order, the square would turn red. His tone became more subdued. "Are you going to rely on the army?" The voice of Mason was brittle. "I would call upon God himself for her," I said. The girl's eyes were filled with excitement. While he was wearing his belt, she clenched both of her scorched fists and whispered, "Father." The crowd underwent a change in perception. A hammer was held in the blacksmith's fist as he took a step forward. "You are correct. She belongs to him," Mrs. Hale said, maintaining a calm tone. "We all saw it. It was her decision. We are not going to have you take her." The words of Jed Cutter were heard murmuring, "Man's word used to mean something. What he did was last night." As a result of being stuck between orders and a town that was unwavering, the soldiers failed. The captain's jaw was quite tight. Hissing, he said, "This is not yet over." In order to indicate his retreat, he yanked the paper shut. "The Fort Larrabee will come back with additional men, and then we shall determine whether or not your word is still valid." Hooves rumbled as the column rolled away, dust consuming the brass as it passed into the air. A hush descended. As she sagged, the girl's knees gave way. Mason grabbed her and brought her in close to him. Governor Dugan let out a sigh. "They are going to come back. The following time, instead of using papers, use fire." Mason turned his gaze from the faces of the people in the town to the infant that he was holding in his arms. "When we meet again, you will be able to see where I stand. You'll find out if a single word can stand up to a whole army," he mutters heavily as the group breaks apart. However, the seed has already been grown. When it came to bearing her destiny, Mason was not alone for the very first time. A second dust line was already stirring up on the horizon, beyond the crest, and it was riders who were not dressed in blue, but rather in black. The men belonging to Raleigh. It was just the beginning of the war. Before the dust from the soldiers had even had a chance to settle, another cloud that was darker and more menacing appeared from the south. It's not a bugle this time. No boots that have been polished. All that could be heard was the jarring roar of hooves and the shine of shotguns in the light of the candle. The men belonging to Raleigh. The number is twice as high as it was previously. The square in the town tightened up. Doors banged shut. Kids were dragged inside by their mothers. "I told you she would bring hell to our doorstep," Caleb murmured over his shoulder. With the female nestled behind him, Mason stood in the open environment. The resonance of his voice was like gravel on steel. The situation is not her hell. If we choose to ignore it, it will be ours. When Sheriff Dugan was holding his firearm, his hand shook. "They will succeed in tearing us apart if we split up now." With the hammer in his hand, the blacksmith led the way forward. "Therefore, we do not go our separate ways." Despite the fact that the scar on his jaw was still fresh, Raleigh reined in at the edge of the light. A sneering smirk spread across his face. "It was a lot of fun hanging out with the family, huh? Now you are going to hand her over, and we are going to walk. In that case, we will bury you alongside her." As Mason walked off the boardwalk, his boots became dispersed in the dust. The phrase, "She is not yours to take," laughing, Rawley made a move at the young lady. "In addition, it is not yours, Mason. No, not by blood, not according to the law. Because you allowed hatred to escape his grasp, you are nothing but a fool." As the throng grumbled, dread began to escalate. With a voice that was soft but commanding, the young lady grabbed Mason's sleeve. "Do not leave. I will," he informed me. "Listen to reason, Mason," Caleb yelled out after Mason. "There will be soldiers coming back, and these hounds are already here. She is not worth every drop that we are about to bleed." Nita took the initiative, which took everyone by surprise. As a result of her blanket falling off, her scarred hands and lean body were exposed. According to her, "I did not ask to be worth," she added with a thick accent, but clear words. "The only thing I requested was that I not be left behind." As the square fell silent, amused, Rawley even cocked his head to the side. "Take a look at that," she said. He spit on the soil when he said, "Brave little rat." However, bravery is not enough to stop gunshots. The hand was raised by him. The riders lowered their firearms and raised their torches higher. Mason's revolver had no longer been concealed. "If you touch her, you will discover whether or not my do." Rawley gave a smirk. "The question is a one-man, one-gun. You actually believe that?" The voice of the blacksmith was loud. He walked to Mason's side, his hammer shining brightly, and said, "Not one." Following that, Mrs. Hale's husband leveled a pistol that had corroded. Pitchforks were lifted by two young farm lads. It was even Jed Cutter who raised his shotgun with a clenched mouth. Rawley's smirk became less robust. "So the entire town has become apathetic." The weapon was now steady as Dugan responded, "No. Everyone in the town is sick of allowing children to perish in the dirt." People did not move for a single heartbeat. Torches made a hissing sound. The horses were stamped. After that, Rawley yelled out, "Take her!" There were cracks in the gunfire. An explosion of dust occurred. Broken windows were found. After pushing Nita behind the trough, Mason fired steadily, making sure that each shot was measured. The wood served as a screen for her, as she clung to it and whispered, "Stay, stay." The blacksmith swung his hammer against the leg of a rider, which caused the rider to fall to the ground. Jed had a wide but booming shot, which caused another to disperse. The man was thrown off the boardwalk after Mrs. Hale herself threw boiling water from a saucepan, causing him to scald. It shouted in chaos. The town, which had been split just a few hours earlier, was now fighting side by side in the dust and flames. Despite the thick smoke, Rawley bared his teeth and charged forward. The barrel of his gun was aimed directly at Mason. Just in the nick of time, Mason spun around. The bullet grazed his arm, causing it to burn. He mumbled, stumbled, but managed to remain upright. Rawley made a sneering sound. Merely standing there. "Let's see how much longer it is." Nita emerged from the trough after crawling out of it, her face covered in blood and dirt. Brent had dropped the bell hammer, and she did not let go of it. Her words were shattered, but yet rang out. "You will not take him." She made a swing. Rawley was struck on the wrist by the hammer. His pistol did not fly. With a rush, Mason landed a blow on Rawley's jaw, causing him to fall to the ground. As soon as they saw their commander fall, the outlaws became weak. Some of them ran away, others cursed, and others fired recklessly before galloping away. A smoke filled the square, and bodies moaned in the dust. Even though it was bloodied and bruised, the town was still standing. At the same time as she was shaking, Nita leaned into Mason. "You stayed," she murmured to herself. With a gruff voice, he placed his good arm around her shoulders and embraced her. "I concur with you." Nevertheless, as Rawley was being taken into the darkness by the remaining members of his army, he yelled through his broken teeth, "Soldiers will be back, because paper is more powerful than your word. When they arrive, she will be mine to keep." Long after the hoofbeats had stopped, the echo continued to reverberate. The conflict was not yet over. The only difference was that it had moved to a larger battleground, pitting law against blood and pen against word. The street continued the smell of smoke and gunpowder even after daybreak had arrived. The area was littered with broken boards, and windows seemed to be hanging broken. While men worked to treat their wounds, Women cleaned blood from the dirt. The town had kept its ground, but everyone was aware that the previous night was merely a warning. By noon, the warning appeared to be accurate. The dust cloud that had just emerged from the north was even larger than the one that had come before it. Flags were flapping in the wind, and bayonets were flashing. Not a single handful was dispatched by the fort this time. A little over 50 were sent. A stony expression appeared on the captain's face as he rode in at the front. A cart that was loaded with iron bars was rolling behind him, and its function was obvious. A new man sat next to him, dressed in civilian clothing. Their coats were black and their glasses sparkled. A leather bag was becoming stuffed with papers. The citizens of the town gathered once more, this time more closely than before. The hammer that the blacksmith used was resting on his shoulder. The shotgun was positioned over Jed Cutter's chest as he leaned rigidly against a post. Mrs. Hale was also present, with flour still on her apron and her mouth tightly closed. Nita was accompanying Mason as he stood in the wide square. With her chin held high, she clenched her hands around his belt, her scorched hands still raw. The skipper did not spend any time in speaking. While the seal was ablaze, he raised the scroll. Orsun, under the threat of treason, this youngster will be taken into care by the federal government, as authorized by the governor of the territory government. Those that put up a fight are considered to be enemies of the state. There was a ripple of gasps. Some of them retreated. A few others murmured. The individual who was wearing the glasses cleared his throat, his voice being thin yet crisp. This so-called adoption of yours is completely meaningless. Dust is what your word is. This document is a legal document. The tone of Mason's voice was consistent. The law did not bleed the night before. She did it. Such a town did it. Because of this, she is ours. Caleb, who was still wearing the bandage on his head, yelled out to the throng, "Don't be such fools. You think you can take on the entire army, don't you? Give her over to me." Despite the fact that Nita's hold on Mason's coat became more firm, she took a half-step forward, which caught everyone off guard. She had a gentle, broken voice that was yet very distinct. I inquired about him. He responded with a yes. "Is that not sufficient?" With a loud thud, the blacksmith drove his hammer into the ground. Indeed, it was visible to us. She belongs to him. A glance from the captain flashed through the audience. "You are in agreement with him, and you are in opposition to the governor." With his gun draped across his chest, Sheriff Dugan took a step forward. His speech was gruff, and his jaw was tense. "If so, then perhaps we do. I would rather bury myself than bury another child in dust because of ink, because I would rather bury myself." The gathering began to stir, consisting of farmers, trappers, and moms holding their children. Something more ancient was fought by fear. The individual who wore glasses yelled out, "This is a form of sedition. I will completely remove you from the map." From the porch, Jed Cutter's voice could be heard in a raspy tone. "Might be. It is preferable to be wiped clean rather than to live crawling under your boots." Darkness appeared on the captain's face. The hand was raised by him. At the same time, bayonets shone brightly and rifles were raised. The air was a wire stretched to the point of breaking. Mason brought Nita closer to him while keeping his gun at his side. Only for her did he lower the volume of his voice. "Girl, are you prepared?" Even though she was shaking, she gave a vigorous nod. "It is true. Remain." "Constantly," he stated. The hand of the captain was raised, and the order was about to be fulfilled. And it was in that eerie calm that the town made its decision. While Mason was standing next to him, the blacksmith entered the street. The husband of Mrs. Hale came next. Then there were two young men from the farm. Then there was the preacher who was holding his Bible proudly in his hands. To the point where Mason and the girl were no longer alone themselves, boots began to scrape forward one by one. The captain's jaw became more creased. He surveyed the faces, which were much too numerous to be cut down without causing the entire valley to catch fire. In a gradual and hesitant manner, his hand lowered. With a voice that sounded like iron scraping stone, he stated, "This is not finished. The fort will come back, more robust and more powerful. On the other hand, your word will not protect you when we do." While he was retreating, he wheeled his horse and barked. While they were marching away, the blue line turned, and dust began to boil. When it was empty, the barred wagon rocked. A hush descended. There will be no cheers. The weight of what had almost broken, and the sound of breathing were all that could be heard. "Father," Nita murmured as she clung to Mason's coat and pushed her face against it. While his eyes continued to focus on the dwindling column of men, he placed his palm on her hair. Although his heart was beating rapidly, his voice remained steady. "Lady, she is—" On the other hand, everyone was aware that the army would come back, and the next time it would consist of fire and chains rather than words and paper. This was merely a postponement of the fight. After a period of 2 days, the valley seized its breath. Nobody worked the fields, and there were no carts arriving at the market. Cattle were restless in their pens, while chickens scratched in quiet at the same time. As the thunder loomed over the horizon, the entire town waited in anticipation. While he was sitting on the porch, Mason had his gun draped across his knees. Under his coat, Nita was curled up with her head resting against his leg. After a short night of sleep, she awoke from dreams in which she was being carried away by ropes. Each and every time she had called out to him, and each and every time he had been around. Although his face was pallid, Brent emerged from the barn. "The scouts have seen them, boss. This time, for more. A cannon, 2 carts, and a cavalry column are all included." "The word struck me like a rock in the chest," she said. The fort was not going to come to argue because it had a cannon. Their time was drawing to a close. With a hushed voice, Mason gently caressed Nita's hair. "Get inside, you young lady." In spite of her dread, she sat up, her eyes shining brightly. "It is not. Here I am." He gave a single nod. On the subject, he did not have the courage to argue with her. By noon, the square was once again completely crowded. While ladies brought water to the youngsters, men loaded weapons, and children were corralled behind closed doors. With his shoulders exposed, the blacksmith stood in the front of the room with his hammer. After the brawl that took place the night before, Jed Cutter rested against the trough with his shotgun steady, his humiliation having been wiped away. The voice of Sheriff Dugan was harsh as he addressed them. "Fort Larrabee is arriving with a vengeance. It is possible that they will burn us, intimidate us, and call us traitors. You are all aware of the stakes that are involved. It is not just Mason who is fighting here. The question is whether or not we allow the word of a man to be more significant than a seal." The throng murmured, with some nodding their heads and others shaking. After that, the thunder ensued. There are lines of horses, sabers are flashing, and gears are grinding. From behind, the cannon rumbled, its iron mouth pointing at the street as if it were passing judgment. The visage of the captain, which was chiseled out of stone, rode to their head. A faint sneer could be seen on the clerk's face as he rode alongside him, his glasses glistening. The column came to a stop. Boots meet the dust. The voice of the captain boomed forth. "This is the last one of your warnings. If the Apache girl is not surrendered, then this town will be forfeited." Mason moved forward while holding a handgun that was loose at his side. Nita clutched to his belt, a minor but constant grip on it. "No," he responded. A brand new order was unrolled by the cashier, and the red wax was still moist. "If you try to resist once more, you will be labeled as rebels. Every single man in this place will be hanging. Every single farm was taken away. Orphans of fools, every youngster in the world." The hammer of the blacksmith was banged down on the rail loudly. "Give it a shot." As Jed Cutter snorted, "It is better to crawl together than to crawl it alone." The captain's jaw became more creased. The arm was raised by him. While the cannon wheels creaked, soldiers were leveling their guns. The atmosphere was tense and acrid, and it was just ready to snap. Even though it was shattering, Nita's voice was powerful. I inquired of him. He responded with a yes. That is the end of it. A roar broke the silence and reverberated off the walls of the room. Women had a gasp. Jaws were clamped by men. A few of the soldiers even shuffled uncomfortably. The hand of the captain shook, but it remained out in front of him. Mason shifted his attention to the town. He spoke with a stony tone. "The line is as follows. Stand up now, or you will remain on your knees forever." The sheriff was the first to move, and he stepped next to Mason while carrying his firearm. As for the blacksmith, then Jed. Then, one by one, boots worked their way through the dust until the square was covered in every gun that the village owned. Behind them, mothers were armed with axes, boys were armed with pitchforks, and elderly men were armed with pistols that had not been shot in years. Darkness appeared on the captain's face. The hand of his hovered. The cannon moved forward with a creaking sound. The words, "Father, please," were murmured by Nita as she clung to Mason's coat. His tone was low and steady, and it was intended solely for her. "I won't let go of you." The arm of the captain was laid down. It shrieked from the bugle. With the sound of thunder, the fort collapsed. And for the very first time in its history, the municipal government took a unified stance against it. It was the scream of the bugle that tore the air apart. The globe then exploded into fire. There was a single, thundering fire of rifles that broke apart. As a house further down the street caught fire, the earth was shaken by the sound of the cannon, which caused glass to shatter and boards to break. The town was transformed into a fortress of dust and flames as women carried children into cellars and men braced weapons on windowsills. Children were dragged into dungeons. Nita was being pushed behind the trough by Mason. "Be humble, young lady. I don't leave your side," she sobbed as she clung to his coat. With one hand, he held her down, and with the other he opened fire with his gun. While one bluecoat fell, another one stumbled backwards. The sound of bone breaking reverberated throughout the mayhem as the blacksmith smashed his hammer into a soldier who was charging forward. As smoke engulfed him, Jed Cutter shot both barrels simultaneously and then reloaded his weapon with hands that were shaking but moving quickly. There was another roar from the gun. Beams began to fall from the church roof as it split. The square was shaped by screams. Nita's face was covered in tears and dirt, and her hands were tightly squeezed around Mason's belt. "Do not leave." "I am not it," he yelled out, shooting once again, dust burning his eyes as he did so. It was the captain's voice that carried over the turmoil as he yelled out commands. "Put an end to their line. Hold on to the youngster." The bayonets of two soldiers were shining brightly as they charged straight for the trough. Mason turned around, his rifle dry. In a manner resembling that of a club, he struck one of them across the jaw. A second lunge was made. While Nita was swinging wildly, she grabbed a fallen plank. However, her stubbornness provided Mason with the breath he needed to draw his handgun and down the man cold. The bayonet had caught wood rather than flesh, which caused it to splinter. He dragged her back till she was against him. "That's enough of a fight, girl," he yelled back at her. Fear did not prevent her eyes from shining brightly as she stared up at him. "It is not. Here I am." "Hold the square," the sheriff yelled as he staggered across the street with blood on his temple. "Hold on to it." As a response, the citizens of the town used fire and steel. There were cracks in the rifles of farmers, antique pistols barking, and even women throwing boiling water out of windows. Soldiers from the fort exerted a great deal of effort, but the town fought back as if the dust itself had teeth. However, the numbers continued to rise. With the gun wheeling forward once more, it was directed directly toward the trough area. Mason's stomach tightened up. In the event that it went off, he and Nita would be disjointed. In the midst of the fire, he dragged her to safety and ran across the square. In spite of the fact that his arm was seared with intense pain and bullets were flying, he continued to move. She was pushed into the blacksmith's shop, and the door was slammed shut behind her. "Remain in this location." Although she was crying, she grabbed his sleeve and spoke in a harsh manner. "You are not missing out." "I'll be back," he said, his eyes clenched tightly. "You have my word," I said. After letting go, she pressed herself against the stone wall of the forge, shivering yet trusting throughout the process. With the heat of the forge at his back and the girl's whisper resonating in his chest, Mason turned his pistol around and went back into the storm in the direction of the storm. There was a signal sent to the gun crew by the captain, who lifted his saber. When it was lowered, the barrel was pointing directly at the business. It was a smash to Mason's heart. There was Nita present. He was aware of what was going to happen next. The battle was no longer for the benefit of the town. It was intended for her. Furthermore, the man who had spent his entire life based on hatred was going to put everything he had on love for the very first time in his life. Flames erupted from the mouth of the cannon as it exploded with force. In response to the shot that ripped through the square, Mason leaped and dived low. The shop of the blacksmith rocked, the timbers cracking and glass falling from the ceiling. When Nita was inside, she yelled his name, but the stone in the forge only just barely held. The street was choked with smoke as it billowed. With his ears ringing and his revolver empty, Mason fell down onto his knees. He observed the crew of the cannon reloading, their hands working so quickly that the captain's saber was cutting through the air. Nita would be taken out of the shop along with it if the next shot was fired. His vision became distorted. His arm, which had been grazed by a bullet, was in excruciating pain as he charged forward. A carbine belonging to a fallen soldier was retrieved by him, and he primed it before firing it directly into the crew. When the ramrod continued to move, one of the men fell and another man faltered. "Pump it up!" The skipper let forth a shout. Mason made a charge. As the iron from the cannon burnt into him, he smashed against it, causing his shoulder to tear. While heaving with every ounce of strength he had left, he pushed his boot under the wheel. The barrel tipped over, making a scratching sound, and then it plunged face first into the dirt. The shot that was fired from inside went off the rails and exploded into the ridge rather than the shop. Rocks slammed down, burying two bluecoats behind the debris that they created. The town suddenly responded with a roar of courage. While he was doing so, the blacksmith yelled out and swung his hammer into the spine of a soldier, while yelling, "You're not going to take her!" Jed Cutter unloaded both barrels into the air completely. Even Mrs. Haleshow, who was wearing a tattered apron, decided to throw a pitchfork into the chaos. However, the captain was not finished. As his eyes remained fixed on Mason, he pulled his saber. "You cost me men, and you hurt me in terms of order. That spoiled brat will make you die." His charge was, in the nick of time, Mason managed to lift his carbine. Steel clashed against steel as the saber slashed down the barrel of the weapon. A few inches away from him, the captain's eyes were blazing. "It's why he growled at me. "The woman is not yours. It's nothing to her." Mason's braces were exposed. The snarl in his voice was low and deep. "I have stated that she is mine, so she is mine." The sword slid out of his grasp and bit into his shoulder. Although he was in excruciating pain, he continued to drive his fist into the captain's jaw. After colliding with the dust, they rolled around and struggled. Mason's handgun butt crashed into his ribs immediately after the blade flashed. He had red streaks in his eyes, and his mouth was blocked with dust. After that, there was a soft scream. "Father!" The captain came to a complete stop, his head flicking toward the shop. As Nita stood in the doorway, frightened but resolute, she held the bell hammer of the blacksmith in both of her burned hands. Using the breath, Mason did so. The captain was pushed back, the saber was pulled free, and it was pointed at his throat. He then forced his leg up and raised it. There was a ripple of silence. With their weapons still pointing but uncertain, the bluecoats paused for a moment. Every weapon that the citizens of the town had lifted was unbroken and bloodied as they stood there. The chest of the captain heaved deeply. The blade of Mason was hovering about an inch away from his jugular. "Give in," Mason yelled out, the lip of the captain curling up. The phrase, "You'll hang for this," Mason responded with a firm voice. "Perhaps. However, she will not." A thin line of crimson beads formed as a result of his pressure on the edge. Waiting for the command, the soldiers moved their positions. Finally, the captain, who was gasping for air, croaked out, "Stand down." Bayonets were lowered. The rifles were lowered. The crew of the cannon retreated while raising their palms. With his chest heaving, Mason allowed the saber to fall. Despite the fact that blood was dripping down his shirt, he stumbled and switched his attention to the store. Nita let go of the hammer and ran towards him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist as she did so. She leaned against his coat and said, "You came back," and while her tears were burning, she was encircled by his strong arm, and his voice was harsh. "As I told you, I do not drop my grip." The groans of those who had been injured, the crackling of flames, and the breath of a community that had survived something that was much larger than itself reverberated across the plaza. A look of embarrassment was etched on the face of the captain as he was taken away and shackled by his own men. Papers belonging to the clerk were found torn and unusable in the dirt. In the midst of the dust, a cowboy who had lived his life on hatred began to kneel with a young lady who had lived her life on loss. Each of them had selected something more powerful. It was over with the struggle. The word had been stable. Nevertheless, the price was etched deeply into the valley. It consisted of blood, ash, and a pledge that no one could ever forget. Over the plaza, the smoke slowly moved in a spiraling motion, ascending into the sky like ghosts emerging from the ground. Men wailed as their wives tied their wounds, and the smouldering of the timbers was accompanied by the glinting of the glass in the ground. At the spot where Mason had tipped the cannon over, it was lying on its side, with the iron mouth cracked and the wheels shattered. Nobody spoke for a considerable amount of time. They simply breathed, remained alive. Nita was snuggled up against Mason's side as he continued to sit on the trough, his shirt shredded and drenched with blood. Since the conclusion of the fight, she had not let go of the other person. It appeared as though the world could still take him away from her, since her head was resting against his ribs and her small hands were clinging to his coat. The graying of Sheriff Dugan's face was accompanied by a steady tone of voice. The town is still present. After looking at Nita, he next turned his attention to Mason. I never imagined that I would see the day that it stood against the fort, he said. The woman is now yours. The law cannot take her away. Mason gave a single nod. I believe that she was mine the moment she made the request. The blacksmith arrived with the hammer resting on his shoulder and his eyes soft. Despite the fact that his arms were streaked with blood and soot, he made the statement, "A word is heavier than paper." All of us witnessed it. In his hands, Jed Cutter held a shotgun that was limp and awkwardly hovering. He didn't sneer for a change of pace. He said, "Guess I was wrong," as he paused. "We were not betrayed by you." He turned around, his face contorted with a mixture of humiliation and something that looked like respect. "You reminded us that we weren't cowards." The last person to arrive was Mrs. Hale, who approached Nita and applied a jar of salve to her raw palms. With a low voice, she whispered, "For the burns. Your grip on that rope was that of a mature adult. Keep in mind that the scars should not prevent you from holding again." The words "thank you" came out of Nita's mouth in a raspy but powerful murmur. People in the town worked together to clean the debris by dusk. In an effort to put out the fire, the men hoisted timbers, the ladies swept the glass, and the children carried buckets of water. For the very first time in my recollection, nobody inquired about Nita's place of origin. Just the fact that they had witnessed her bleeding next to them was sufficient evidence. After entering the ranch home, Mason sat down in a chair, feeling the weight of tiredness pressing down on him. In the opposite seat, Nita sat with eyes that were too ancient for her years, yet steadfast. With her little fingers, she reached across the table and found his calloused hand inside her grasp. Again she said, "You stayed," and this time the words were more of a promise than a question. He gave her a long look before nodding his head. "And I'll continue to remain here, so long as there is air to breathe." Even when tears began to fill up in her eyes, she did not cry. Just now she gave his hand a more firm grip. "If that is the case, then I am not alone." Mason clutched his chest tightly. Over the course of his entire existence, he had sworn hatred and carried the burden of loss like a badge. And now, in the peace that followed the smoke and the blood, he realized that what he had earned was more significant than either of them, but not retribution. No, not pride. It is a daughter. The valley was a ravaged landscape outside. One day, the fort might come back, this time with men who have more papers and more firearms. On the other hand, Mason was aware that he would not be confronting it by himself. The town had made a decision once. They would make a return decision. Additionally, in the event that they did not, if it were to come down to him and the girl, that would sufficient. At the moment when the stars began to shine brightly over the desert, Nita placed her head on his arm. It had been a long time since Mason could recall, but he finally gave himself permission to relax. The word reverberated in his head more loudly than any gunshot, "I am your father." And her response, as kind as a solemn promise, pressed back into the darkness, "The daughter." There was a single word, that was whispered in the dust and blood, that transformed a guy who loathed into a parent who lived. What would you have done then? Would you have carried her into your life? Or would you have walked past her in the dirt? Tell us about it in the comments. Subscribe to receive more stories about the frontier, and make sure you don't miss the next story when love, bravery, and choice come into conflict against the most insurmountable odds.